Folks, we are back at Lantern Lessons. What is Lantern Lessons? It is a history podcast that discuss your God-given liberties. And the lantern protects the flame of liberty that is inside of it. And that's what we're here to talk about. Welcome to another edition of Lantern Lessons. Today, we are going to be talking about a man who is very near and dear to my heart. Interestingly enough, in the 1800s, I had two grandfathers that named sons after the man that we're going to talk about tonight. He is been rightly described as a hero of two worlds, both the American continent and a hero in his native France. The man that we are going to discuss today is the one and only, the singular, Marquis de Lafayette. His presence in the American Revolution and subsequently in the French Revolution were as prominent as anybody that was involved in either two of those revolutions. George Washington is described as the father of this country and perhaps the indispensable man to our revolution. We know that that is truth, but we also know that without the Marquis de Lafayette, there would have been no ability for France to enter the war the way that they did. And we often forget that there were more Frenchmen at the Battle of Yorktown, which was the decisive battle of the Revolution, than there were Americans. And perhaps because of no other man more so than Lafayette. And what I love most about him is his passion. I love the fact that as a very, very young man, he had that spirit of revolution inside of him, almost inexplicably. Lafayette was born in 1757, as so many of the greats, revolutionaries were born in the early to mid part of the 18th century. Lafayette was born into great nobility. His father was an officer, a colonel in the French army. And when Lafayette was very young, his father was killed in a battle with the English on the European continent. Prior to him being killed, his father received a letter that he had a son back home. And he likely would have been overwhelmed by that, because this was the era when firstborn sons received everything that their fathers and their families had. They received not only all the money, but all of the glories and all of the responsibility to keep the name and to make sure that the name was added and that honor and glory were added to the name. When his father was killed, it was a significant French defeat. His father was decapitated by an English cannonball. And Lafayette never got over that. Neither did his mother. Lafayette's mother took the death of her husband extremely hard. She couldn't even raise Lafayette when he was very young because of it. And she left him in the country with her paternal grandmother. Her husband's mother, Lafayette's grandma, raised him for many, many years when he was a young child. And she did a couple of things that were very interesting. She instilled in Lafayette a strong desire to win glory on the battlefield. Her son had been killed by the English, and she knew the history of the Lafayette family and its name. One of Lafayette's distant relatives, one of his grandfathers, fought as a general and a marshal of France with Joan of Arc at the Battle of Orleans. The decisive battle, her first victory, and one that helped achieve France's independence and allowed it to be saved from the English. So Lafayette's grandmother knew about this. She knew that the greatest way to achieve honor and glory was to win it on the battlefield. And she instilled that in a young Lafayette. She also did a couple of things that were noteworthy for the time. Although the Lafayettes were part of the French nobility and they were quite wealthy and they had their own castle or chateau, she allowed Lafayette to commingle with the commoners, and he actually played with kids that were not from the nobility, peasant kids that were from the little town that they were in. And she wanted him to understand the commoners. She wanted him to understand that being a nobleman meant that you had duties and responsibilities to the commoners who often served the nobility. And that was unusual for the time. Too often, the nobility separated themselves from the peasants, and that was not the case with Lafayette's grandmother. She was an extraordinary woman. About the time Lafayette was about 10 or so, his mother finally came back into the picture. She had gone to live with her parents in Paris, and her parents were also part of the nobility. Her father was the commander of the Black Musketeers, which was a detachment of soldiers that actually were part of the King's Life Guard. Louis XVI had ascended to the French throne, and her father was definitely part of that group that was on the inner circle. This is Lafayette's mother's father, so his other grandfather. And when he was 13 years old, Lafayette was commissioned in the French military. He had spent a lot of his younger years reading and studying military history, and he was primed to go into the French military, which he did at a very young age, at 13. And he was under the command of his grandpa at first, and then eventually became under the command of another man who would become his father-in-law. Lafayette was becoming a French gentleman during this time frame. His mother and maternal grandfather died soon after he came to Paris, and about the time he was 14 or so, he was alone in the world. He did have uncles, and he did have some other people that helped him, but his mother and his mother's father died, and he at that time met another man who would ultimately become his father-in-law, and he was introduced to his future wife, Adrienne. And a couple of years later, they were married when Lafayette was 16 and she was 14. They were part of the upper crust, and because Lafayette had inherited money from both his father and mother's side, he was essentially the wealthiest man in France outside of the king himself. And he was gaining much notoriety. About the time he was married, he was sent over to England to meet with one of his other relatives who was the ambassador to England from France. And he actually got to meet King George III. And this young French nobleman, Lafayette, went into the king and spellbounded the king. King George III could not believe how charismatic, how knowledgeable, how gregarious this young French nobleman was, and little could King George III have ever understood or known that one day Lafayette would be leading troops, in a very short time, be leading troops in America against him. Had they known that at the time, I'm sure they would have taken some proactive measures against him, but they did not. Lafayette was, during this time when he was first married, was again commissioned into the French military, and he was a voracious learner, constantly reading and studying tactics of both the French military and other great military powers that were on the European continent. And he found a very strong desire, and this was part of the Enlightenment at the time, to be part of something bigger than himself. He had been studying all of these Enlightenment philosophers who were discussing things like liberty, equality, this notion that kings had taken so much from the commoners, and that noblemen like himself, their highest calling was to try to look out for those that were less fortunate. And he became enthralled with this notion. Now remember, his father had been killed by the English, so he had truly a blood vendetta against them. And he learned of the American Revolution about this time in his life, and he became obsessed with it. He wanted desperately to go to America and win glory for himself and for France and for the Lafayette name. But more than that, he wanted to go to America and he wanted to fight for liberty. So he decided that he was going to buy a ship and that he was going to take a few hundred men with him, all at his own expense, to America. His father-in-law, who was his commanding officer, found out about this and went to the king and asked the king to order Lafayette not to go. The king obliged, and he did order Lafayette not to go to America. He thought that a nobleman of that stature, again, perhaps the second richest man in France, going over to America, if he were to be caught or killed, or if he were to be found out, that it was going to bring a lot of discredit to France. France was constantly fighting with England, and there was no love lost between the two. But the king did not want to recklessly endanger terrible relationships anyway by potentially having one of his greatest noblemen go over to America. Ultimately, Lafayette found himself on the high seas, and he, with this purchased ship and men, he was headed to America. And he was writing letters to his wife on the high seas on the voyage over, telling her things like, "My happiness and the happiness of America are inextricably linked. I know that America will be the bastion of liberty for this world." And why Lafayette knew or understood any of this is baffling when you think about it. Why would he know such things? Why would he put so much credit on the revolution of colonies against Great Britain? Why did Lafayette have such a fervor in his soul? I can only attribute it to the Spirit of God. I can only attribute it when you read his writings and you try to get inside his mind. He is so adamant about this revolution that's going on. His ship lands in Charleston, South Carolina, and he is immediately welcomed as a great hero. His name is known in the colonies, and he promptly gives the city of Charleston a significant sum of money to help them with the cause, and he charters himself a carriage and wants to go directly to the camp of George Washington. He arrives in Philadelphia and he presents himself to the Continental Congress, and John Hancock and others are not impressed. There had been a stream of French noblemen that had come over to America with these grandiose ideas to serve in the military and to get commissions perhaps higher than their station, and for glory and honor do all of these things. And the French noblemen that had come had really not done a very good job and had not impressed the Americans at all. Lafayette was different. He came with letters from Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, who were diplomats to France from America, and they had described Lafayette as a very important Frenchman, and that they had actually offered him a major generalship in the Continental Army if he would come over and fight, all at his own expense. Ultimately, the Continental Congress did make him a major general, but they told him he was not going to be able to command any troops, that it was an honorary title, and that he was going to have to fight on his own. He was going to fight without expenses of any kind, and that he wasn't going to be paid or given supplies or anything else. Lafayette enthusiastically decided that that was good enough for him. When he initially met George Washington in the field, Washington was immediately struck by this nobleman's person. He was confident. He was charismatic. He was intelligent. He spoke better English than most of the French noblemen did. And Lafayette and Washington instantaneously created a bond. Washington was a man who was in his midlife, and he did not have sons of his own. And Lafayette instantaneously kind of fulfilled this surrogate son role for him. And it was incredible that even before any fighting came, that the two of them came together, and there was great attachment between the two of them. Soon after he arrived, the Battle of Brandywine Creek ensued, and it was a hot skirmish. Lafayette went into the field and essentially said that he would fight as a common soldier. But his leadership prowess and his knowledge of military tactics became so apparent that people fell in behind him and allowed him to lead them. During the Battle of Brandywine Creek, he suffered a shot to the leg, a rifle shot to the leg, which injured him gravely. It shot him off his horse. And even after he had been injured, he still continued to give commands and try to lead his men until there was so much loss of blood that it was feared that he was going to die. And he was taken from the field, and Washington ordered his doctor to take care of Lafayette as if he were his own son. Lafayette survived, and he impressed Washington greatly with his courage and with his ability to face gunfire and cannon fire with stoicism, much like Washington did himself. And instantly, again, this father and son relationship, surrogate father and son relationship, was just buttressed at Brandywine Creek. Soon after that, the Continental Army went to Valley Forge for the winter of 77-78. And during that time, Lafayette was there. He had recovered from his wounds, and he actually led a few forays, and he took a few troops and engaged the British at a couple of very small skirmishes during that time at Valley Forge. And he impressed the commanders. He impressed Nathaniel Greene. He impressed Henry Knox. He impressed Washington with his fervor and his skills that he had. And he was able to really make a difference. He was actually reckless at times with himself, reckless with his life, and reckless with some of the tactics that he employed with some of the men that were fighting underneath him. But time and time, Providence seemed to favor him. And soon after that, George Washington really saw him as the link between getting more French resources to come to America. And he asked Lafayette to go back home, which he did. Lafayette sailed for France, and when he got there, he was instantaneously arrested. Again, the Louis XVI had ordered him not to go, but that imprisonment was basically just a slap on the wrist, so to speak. When he was confined at his father-in-law's house, all of the French nobility came to the house to congratulate him. He was becoming a superstar because the French had found out about his exploits. They were being written about in all the French newspapers, and they saw him for what he was, a revolutionary hero. He went over there and successfully campaigned Louis XVI to grant him more troops and send French armies over to battle with the Americans. However, he was not to be the commander of the French forces. That would fall to a man by the name of General Rochambeau. Rochambeau had come to prominence in the 1740s and 50s in some of the wars that France fought both on the European continent and in America during the French and Indian War. Rochambeau was a hero himself and a marshal, a marshal in the French military. He was sent with Lafayette to go back to America to fight. And when they got back to America, most of the fighting had moved to the south, and America was really holding on. Washington was back in the northern parts and was trying to keep the British contained in New York City. And when the French got back with Lafayette and Rochambeau, they were able to successfully intimidate the British to leave Philadelphia and really go back to New York, where they stayed for the rest of the war. Soon after that, there was the Battle of Yorktown, which was the decisive battle of the Revolutionary War. In that battle, Rochambeau played a key role with General George Washington, the overall commander. But Lafayette was given a divisional command as a true general at that battle, and they were able to secure a victory there over Lord Cornwallis, who was the British commander at Yorktown. And when the British surrendered in October of 1781, the commander, Lord Cornwallis, tried to give his sword to Rochambeau, and Rochambeau would not accept that sword. He said that it needed to go to George Washington. Lafayette was highly impressed by that, and the amount of respect and admiration that were growing for Washington and Lafayette as one of his top generals was significant. After the Battle of Yorktown, soon after that, Lafayette went back to France. And this time when he went back to France, he was greeted as an international hero, a true hero of France. His status had been elevated so significantly that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were very impressed with the Lafayettes. So both Lafayette and his wife Adrienne were now elevated to the highest levels of the French nobility because they were good friends with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette at their return. Lafayette was there when the Treaty of Paris was signed, which was the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War officially. He pushed very hard for America to get the most favorable contracts in that. He made sure that America was taken care of. And his adopted country could never have been better served by him than they were at the Treaty of Paris. After that, Lafayette was a superstar. And he actually went back to America in 1784 to do a quick little tour. He spent time with George Washington at Mount Vernon and was able to tour around America and see where liberty was going and what it was doing. Although the Constitution had not been ratified yet, he could see that America was rapidly becoming this place where liberty could thrive, this place where the world could see that freedom would be something different, something unusual, and something that the world had never seen. And he was very gratified by it. When he got back to France in 1785, he was the biggest superstar that France had ever seen. And he did some things during that time that really endeared himself to both the nobility and the commoners. He pressed for libertarian ideas, and he was very instrumental in trying to get Louis XVI to see things a little bit differently. And the commoners really saw him as their champion at that time. Throughout the late 1780s, the revolutionary spirit of France started to rise and started to become something that was frankly unstoppable. And in 1789, as so many of you know, the French Revolution burst into flame. The Bastille, the great prison in France, was stormed in Paris, was stormed by the commoners, and there was great political unrest. At the time, there was a bread shortage in Paris, and the commoners had gone out to Versailles to basically demand that they get flour for bread. And at the time, Lafayette was the commander-in-chief of the armies, and he was of the National Guard, and he was tasked with trying to keep peace. And really, he's the only man that could have kept any sort of semblance of peace at the time. The crowd went out to Versailles, and they were livid. They wanted something done, and they demanded. At one point, there was this unbelievable scene where you had tens of thousands of people at Versailles banging at the door, assaulting guards, wanting something to be done. And Lafayette brings Marie Antoinette, the queen, out on a balcony, and he kisses her hand, and the crowd went crazy. They loved it because their hero was out there acknowledging the crown, but he was doing it in their behalf. And the crowd wanted the king to come back to Paris and be with the people. Lafayette asked him to do so, and he did. And for a time there was some peace, but ultimately the French Revolution caught fire, and the king had to call an assembly of notables and called the three classes of the French country into session. He called the clergy, he called the nobility, and he called the commoners together for a great council that had not been called together in 200 years. And this was something that all kings had really tried to avoid. As the French Revolution became increasingly bloody, Lafayette found himself in the very inauspicious position of being an enemy to both camps. He had tried to walk the moderate way, and neither the loyalists that were loyal to the crown and the commoners who wanted their own government, neither one of them thought that he was taking strong enough positions on either side. So as it became increasingly bloody, he found himself where he had to resign his commission as the general of the National Guard, and ultimately the revolutionaries issued an arrest warrant for Lafayette. He attempted to flee the country after the arrest warrant with about 20 other officers. They went up to northern France and actually made it to a town that was controlled by the Austrians, and he was hoping to seek passage to a neutral country like Switzerland. And when the Austrians got him, they did not let him go anywhere. They imprisoned him, and for 4 years, Lafayette was exposed to some of the harshest treatment imaginable. He was deprived of clean food. He was deprived of air. He was kept in dark places and did not see sunlight for extended periods of time. They were very cruel to him. They tortured him, frankly, for 4 years. At one point, his wife, Adrienne, did come to the prison with him and chose to be incarcerated with him than to live without him, which was a huge show of solidarity with her husband. But during that time that he was in prison, George Washington was the president of the United States. Napoleon had come to power in France. And Washington had sent numerous letters to the Austrians asking them to release Lafayette. But it was Napoleon, the petitions of Napoleon, that caused the Austrians to acquiesce to those requests. And when they released Lafayette 4 years after he was originally incarcerated, they did so at the request of Washington. That's what they told the world. But in reality, they had done it because they were fearful of Napoleon, who had beaten them on the battlefield, and they truly didn't like the man. After Lafayette was released from prison, he was extremely grateful to Napoleon and actually had some passing respect for the man. He was not allowed to go back to France. Napoleon made it very clear to Lafayette when he was released that he was not welcome back in France. And for a number of years, he had to live in Hamburg, which was in Prussia at the time. But he lived there, and he was rifling through the family fortune. And he had spent so much of it on the American Revolution and on the French Revolution that he was getting to the point he was out of money. Adrienne lobbied tirelessly for her husband to be allowed back into France. And after several years, Lafayette did sneak back into France. He was caught by Napoleon. Napoleon was outraged when he found out that Lafayette was trying to get back to France. And he did acquiesce and allow Lafayette to stay, and he was able to send for his wife and his family, and they were able to move back to France. Napoleon he had really issued a blood vendetta against the Lafayette family. Lafayette had a son, George Washington Lafayette, who was serving under Napoleon's command in the French army, as well as a son-in-law, and both men had really distinguished themselves on the battlefield as significant officers, very capable. But Napoleon's regime would not promote them, and both of them ended up leaving the army because of it. Napoleon was able to live in France underneath Lafayette was able to live in France underneath Napoleon's leadership and his rule. But at this time, Lafayette was very much isolated, and Napoleon saw to it that he was. He petitioned Lafayette many times, trying to get him to come into the government and take significant roles in Napoleon's regime, but Lafayette refused to do so, citing the fact that he was a dictator and that he was not interested in the liberty of man, and would not work with Napoleon, and became a very vocal critic. Lafayette found himself elected to public office and was able to get into and be a deputy in the assembly. And when Napoleon, near the end of his regime, and when he was conquered at Waterloo, it was Lafayette that rose in the assembly and declared the assembly in permanent session, and suggested that they make a law that it would be treason to stop the assembly. And what that did is it telegraphed to Napoleon that he was the outsider. He was this dictator that was being deposed. And Napoleon hated Lafayette, always after that. Until his very dying day, he hated the name of Lafayette because he was instrumental in getting him removed as the Emperor of France. Now, it's clear that Napoleon was defeated on the battlefield by the combined forces of the British, the Prussians, and the Russians at Waterloo. But back home in the assembly, it was Lafayette that led the cause that ultimately led Napoleon to Napoleon's demise back home. After this time, France really fell into extreme disorder. The revolution in France was far bloodier than the American Revolution. The turmoil was far more significant. You were dealing with a much more powerful country, a country that had a far larger population, and one that was not done with Republican values. It was very much trying to remove a powerful monarchy. And France slipped back into their old ways. And Louis XVIII, who was a direct descendant of Louis XVI, ascended to the French throne in the 1820s. And at this point, Lafayette's starting to age, and he is very much a man of the people. And he is serving in elected offices as a deputy in the Assemblée Nationale. And he found himself at odds with the new monarchy. Louis XVIII didn't like Lafayette. In fact, Lafayette was invited back to America by President James Monroe in 1824. He was asked to come back to America and tour. And Monroe wanted to send a United States warship to transport him from France to the United States, and Lafayette refused that. He said, no, that looks far too militaristic. It looks far too authoritarian for my taste. And he chartered a ship and left. But when he left France in 1824, the people of France saw him and treated him for the hero that he was. They gathered together and they sent him off with a hero's departure. And Louis XVIII got the crowd broken up, was very upset, did not want Lafayette to go to America, but he did. When Lafayette got to America, he received a true hero's welcome. During his year back in America from 1824 to 1825, and he brought his son George Washington Lafayette with him, he toured every state in the United States, and he was shocked when he got to New York City. For 4 solid days, the city of New York came to a standstill. Fathers and grandfathers were bringing their children and grandchildren out to see the great hero. When he emerged back in America, they said that he came back from the dead. He came back from a different age. He was this hero of the Revolution that was bigger than life, and America loved him. They saw him for the revolutionary that he was, and they had reverence for him that they had for very few of even their own patriots, George Washington and maybe just a couple of others. But as he toured America, he was impressed with the nation. He was impressed with what the Constitution had been able to achieve. He was impressed with the industry of America. He was impressed with the revolutionary and liberty-loving blood of the Americans. He commented on it wherever he went. He received a hero's welcome in every single town he went. They would stop what they were doing. They would have parties, and they would have balls, and they would name cities after him. Fayetteville, North Carolina was the first one that was named after Lafayette, but there were many others that were named after him. And even subsequent to that time, there have been a number of cities and towns in America that have been named for Lafayette. He was this man that just, they couldn't believe their eyes. They couldn't believe that they were actually seeing him. He was so young during the Revolution. He came to America at first when he was 18 years old, and he had the stories and the heroics of his time were just incredible. And he was invigorated. There were a number of things that he did while he was here. He went and visited John Adams at Peacefield, Massachusetts, was able to dine with him. He went to Virginia and met with Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. He went down and saw General Andrew Jackson at the Hermitage just out of Nashville at his place. He toured the country, and he would often stay and have dinners with these prominent men, the former presidents of the United States. And he was just emotionally reinvigorated. And he found himself at Bunker Hill for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was an unbelievable time there, where they dedicated that ground and had the obelisk there that was the cornerstones were laid to. And he instructed his son to take dirt from Bunker Hill, because that was such an important battle of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson has described Bunker Hill as the most important day. June the 17th, 1775 is the most important day in American history, and Lafayette saw it as that, and he took dirt from Bunker Hill and instructed his son that he wanted to be buried in that dirt back in Paris when he died. And his son obliged him with that. But Congress was the fervor of this visit took hold to the extent that Congress, at the advice of President Monroe, voted that they were going to give Lafayette several $100,000 that in today's dollars would equate to $8 to $10 million. And that was a sign of extreme respect. It was an acknowledgement that this French nobleman had spent so many millions of his own dollars during the Revolution that they wanted to try to repay that. And it was an acknowledgement that he had risked so much. And I thought it was a gesture that it was so touching to me, that America would pause and that Congress would pass this bill that they would give millions of dollars in today's dollars to Lafayette. And he was extremely touched by that. But when he went back to France in 1825, he went back with renewed vigor. This was a man that was aging. He was into his 60s and late 60s, and he was starting to, really slow down, but that trip to America lit a fire back in him. And in 1827, he was reelected to the Chamber of Deputies, and he became and while he was gone, Louis XVIII had died, and Charles X had taken over as king. Charles X was really moving the monarchy to despotism. He had suspended a lot of the free press. He was not allowing a number of liberties that the previous king had agreed to with Lafayette and others that had been petitioning for that. And Lafayette became a very vocal critic of Charles X. And he pressed and pressed and pressed in the Assemblée Nationale and was able to get it to a point that France was whipped up into a sufficient frenzy back in 1830 that they were going to have another revolution, which ultimately Charles X was deposed. Lafayette was the general of the National Guard when the forces of the revolutionaries and the king clashed. And Lafayette and the revolutionaries succeeded in another French Revolution in 1830. But this time, Lafayette was in his 70s, and he did not want this to degenerate into the bloodshed that the previous revolution had degenerated into. And he was cognizant and he was measured. And although he was very much a man of libertarian principles, he believed that the best form of government was a constitutional monarchy where you had a king that was in place, but a king that had ceded powers and ceded liberties to the people in written format in a way that would give the power to the people and to their assemblies and to representatives that would be elected to an assembly of some kind. There was a power vacuum at the time, and there were a number of people of the revolutionaries that wanted Lafayette to take over as the dictator of France, essentially, in 1830, and he rejected that. Much like his mentor and surrogate father, George Washington, he rebuffed that and said, no, I am not going to be a dictator. I am not going to move into this position of power and deprive people of the rights that God has given them. And he resisted that. And he was successful in lobbying for Louis Philippe to become the new king of France. And Louis Philippe said that he was going to give the power to the people and he was not going to become this tyrant that Charles X had become. In a very short period of time, as so many men with absolute power do, Louis Philippe became a man who was very much about subjugating the people and about taking rights away from them, rights, God-given rights. And Lafayette was just appalled by that. And again, in his position as a deputy in the Assemblée Nationale, he fought fervently for the rights of his fellow Frenchmen and the rights of man and the citizens. And he gave his very last speech in the assembly right before he died in 1834 at the age of 76. And upon his death, it's difficult to describe the vacuum that was left, both in France and in the United States. President Andrew Jackson, who was the president of the United States at the time of Lafayette's death, ordered black bunting to be put up all over Washington, D.C. Congress, both houses of Congress, both in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, black draperies and buntings were hung for 30 days. The senators and representatives wore badges on their lapels in honor of him. The only other time that had been done in the United States is when George Washington had died in 1799. No one had been given that kind of respect and admiration. There's some interesting things to note. Lafayette was ultimately buried in Paris next to his wife. I've been to the gravesite. It's a very tiny little place just behind a church there in Paris. Even today you can go there. Don't go on Sunday, it's actually closed. But France recognized him. The country really came to a halt, and Louis Philippe gave him a full military honors funeral. And many speeches were given, many articles were written in newspapers, many things were said. John Quincy Adams, who was the former president, of the United States at that time, he said that he eulogized Lafayette and called him one of the greatest spirits who had ever been sent to this earth, and that no greater friend to liberty had ever been alive. It's interesting to note his legacy. In World War I, when France was literally on its back and the Germans were gaining ground, America entered World War I. And when Blackjack Pershing, the general of the Allied armies that were sent over there from America, the commander of American troops, the first thing that he did when he came to France is he went to Lafayette's grave. And he said, "We are here to repay our debt to you." Publicly, he said that at Lafayette's grave. He was buried in that dirt from Bunker Hill. And I think the most interesting aspect of Lafayette in his death is this. When the Germans occupied Paris from about 1940 to 1944, during that 4-year period, there was one American flag that flew in Paris, and that was at the grave of Marquis de Lafayette. The Germans had so much respect for what Lafayette had done during his time as a military commander. The Wehrmacht commander who was in charge of Paris, the German army officer that in charge of Paris, would allow a military color guard to march to Lafayette's grave every morning and put up the American flag. And then every evening, that same color guard would march to Lafayette's grave, take the American flag down for the night. And he did this for 4 years. It's amazing to me that the respect and admiration from a fellow military man, albeit one that Lafayette would have had no respect for whatsoever, who was occupying his beloved France at the time. It's amazing to me that there was so much respect for this man 100 years after he had died, that he was allowed a full military color guard to make sure that the flag of America flew over his grave. And that's the case today. It's an American flag flying over Lafayette's grave. He is considered one of our greatest, or one of her greatest sons. I testify to you this more than anything. Lafayette was a servant of the King of this land, Jesus Christ. It is inarguable that his contributions to the founding of this nation are without equal. The only other man that could even conceivably take the place of Lafayette as one of the great patriots of our revolution would be George Washington. He's the only man that could even equate to what Lafayette did. His legacy lives on. It lives on in the hearts of Americans. If you go and you travel around America, for those that know our history, there's no one that doesn't hold Lafayette in great reverence. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking this into your heart and soul. And God bless America, and God bless Marquis de Lafayette. Thank you.